You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood, art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and joining me once again, I have David Lee Csicsko, the illustrator and co-author of Iconic Artists. I am so happy you came back to talk to us about three female artists today. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Kyle.
So I am super excited to always talk about people who are passionate about art history, but I'm really interested in your lens as an artist tackling other artists. We'll get a little bit more into that later, but can you just start with your design style, your illustration style, and how you developed your look? Because these illustrations are gorgeous, but it's strange. They're in some ways like nothing I've ever seen before, but also there are so many elements that feel sort of comfortable and familiar to me. I can't quite put my finger on it. Can you describe how you came to, draw the way you do?
So I was an art kid. I was drawing posters all the time. I did really well in art. I trained very hard for it in the same way that someone wants to be in the Olympics has to work really hard. I took art very seriously. I had my favorite artists like Toulouse-Lautrec, Calder, Picasso was a big influence on me. But I also loved older art, and I especially love art from the Middle Ages. That I find totally fascinating. But I went off to art school, graduated, and everyone was doing things with an airbrush as far as design and illustration, and I couldn't afford one. So I had this old portfolio that my high school art teacher had made that said David Lee Csicsko, Morton Senior High, Hammond, Indiana, and there's no way I could take that into like a job interview. So I bought some black contact paper, and I cut it out with an X-Acto knife and made it into a beautiful black cardboard portfolio. But what I noticed that day was how easy it was to cut. And so with the leftover scraps with my X-Acto knife, I just started drawing and cutting out simple shapes, which turned into little figures and people. And it was at the time of when new wave and punk music was very popular. So it was very easy to draw people with exaggerated mohawk haircuts because I was cutting out with a knife. And slowly I started to get noticed. I got jobs with Chicago Magazine, became a regular there. Eventually I started getting assignments from Marshall Fields. I started doing things for the Chicago Tribune, and my style kept evolving. Then the computer came along, and I couldn't afford to buy a computer, but eventually I got a computer, and I was able to sort of do my cutout shapes, but now on the computer. So my art has always been very shaped based. Maybe that's why I like Calder so much. But it kind of kept evolving and evolving, and then I also expanded from not just illustrations and posters, but I started designing mosaics and stained glass windows, and I started working in schools. I designed the mosaics at the Belmont L. I designed the stained glass windows at Lurie Children's Hospital. I got to design all the Christmas decorations for the Obama White House in 2012. And then I started doing these portraits just kind of for fun that I wanted to do something quickly. So I made a couple of portraits for a friend of mine who was plays the harpsichord and was having a concert with Bach music, and I thought he needs a poster. So I took about an hour on the computer. I drew a really quick, fun image of Bach, and people really liked it. And then it kind of led me to wanting to do more portraits. So I did portraits of musicians and classical composers, and then I jumped into architects and then scientists and doing projects with the Museum of Science and Industry. So if my work feels comfortable, maybe it's because you've seen a lot of it. It's around. I'm part of the visual fabric of Chicago. Knock on wood. It's something I love doing. I'm so happy that I get to do what I do. I get to draw every day. But I hope I'm answering the question.
Yeah. And I guess, for clarity for listeners who aren't aware of this, I'm seeing a lot of your work around Chicago because I'm also in the Chicago area. There's, a little bit of overlap with our biographies there. You were designing stuff for the Obama White House right around the time that I had a group of students that I brought to the White House for their first, the Obama administration had a student film festival, and my students were named as official selections for the first ever White House Student Film Festival right around that time. I mean, possibly seeing the same decorations that you had out. But I also just laughed when you talked about not having a portfolio. And I remember applying to the School of the Art Institute. I literally did not have a portfolio. I went in with all of my stuff, like bundled together and like tied up in twine. And I can only imagine what they were thinking as they saw me shamble through the doors. But I want to get your perspective on a couple of female artists today. And I want to start with one. Like, I grew up going to Catholic schools. I heard a lot about Sister Wendy, and I don't know how I was not familiar with Sister Corita Kent. Can you explain a little bit about her biography, why you found her to be such an interesting artist? And I would also love to know, like, how was it trying to portray another artist as an artist? Like, did you try to make your illustration more her style, or was it more your take on her? I just want to know all the things.
Sure. Okay. All the things. So, I kind of have two nicknames for myself. One is that I'm a visual detective. So with all the pictures that I made for the Archonic Artist book, I'm trying to put in clues that describe what the artist did. I'm not trying to copy their work in any way, but I'm trying to suggest what their art looks like, so that this will be a springboard that you see this image, you read these one-page descriptions that you'll want to go and look them up and find out more about them. So how I came to know of Sister Corita Kent was when I was in high school. I designed as a senior, not knowing anything. I came in and I said, I'm going to design the set for the musical, which was a musical about a French circus called Carnival, which then took me back to looking at Toulouse-Lautrec. So basically, I made this set that looked like Toulouse-Lautrec drawings, but they were my drawings. And so the librarian of the school gave me as a gift for the work that I did for this musical, a book by Corita Kent of her images called Everything But the Circus. See, it's all connected. Anyway, there were these amazing wood engravings that she had found that she used with really bright colors. So to give you a little about her history, she was a nun in a very progressive Catholic order. They had an amazing women's college called Immaculate Heart College. And we were very progressive. She was very much a woman of her time, but also a woman within the church. So her students, they would make posters about peace and love. This was in the 60s, and they were just reacting to what was happening in the world. So there were a lot of protests against the Vietnam War, and her students made these very colorful, very loving images that said peace and love and understanding. But she was really kind of breaking these grounds and also encouraging her students to use and react to the world that they were living in. And she also used really bright colors. Like, she was one of the first artists to play with day glow colored paint, sort of paint that sort of what we think of as like hot pink or neon yellow or lime green. There were these fluorescent colors that she was using that were silkscreen inks. So in the way that Toulouse-Lautrec mixed his own inks when he made his posters, Sister Corita Kent was buying these sort of poppy colors. And she also really believed, she loved her life as a nun, and often the images she did were from the good verses of the New Testament, of like, be kind to others. She kind of used the scripture but she was a pop artist, and Eventually, she was really getting noticed, but the Vatican decided that these nuns were way too progressive, and they wanted to make sure they weren't going off topic. So eventually, sadly, the Vatican decided their order couldn't exist anymore. So she went into public life, but she by this time was making a big. She had quite a big following within the arts. But because she was a woman and because she had been a nun, she never achieved the pop status that, say, Warhol did, just because he was a man. But she found work. She did things for General Mills. She did a stamp for the post office, a love stamp. She did all these kind of campaigns, and then she also really loved older imagery. So she found these old wood blocks of like circus figures of a bareback rider or a clown, and then she would cut out a giant C for clown and juxtapose this sort of black and white image with this day glow image, or often using bright colored accents like different colored sized dots. So in the image I did of her, it's her in the habit, but her habit, people always say, well, nuns look like penguins. To get you this sense of her love of pop color, her habit has almost like an exaggerated street light, or a traffic light. That she's wearing this black habit, like a black veil, or a black, in contemporary terms, kind of like a structured black hoodie, but it has these bright dots of yellow, green, and blue. And it's really about the color, because that's what really gave her so much excitement.
Yeah, and I gotta say, I love anyone who's using day glow colors. There's something that is just so cheerful and bright and bold and eye-catching. And for those unfamiliar, check the links in the show notes. I did an episode on the Schweitzer brothers and how they came up with day glow colors, and I absolutely love that story too. Now, after a short break, we're going to get into another story of another iconic artist. So now I want to talk about another artist that I feel hasn't gotten her due. And I honestly kind of feel bad I haven't talked about her on an episode yet, because I've seen the work so many times, and I'm sure listeners, if you're looking at the images, you'll be like, oh yeah, I've seen this, but it's not a household name. Tamara de Lempicka was sort of doing stuff in the roaring 20s, painting these portraits that are absolutely gorgeous. Do you want to talk a little bit about her and why you included her in the book, and how her style might have influenced your illustrations of her?
So when I was starting out, Art Deco was kind of making a big revival in the 80s. So I was doing these cutout figures with contact paper that were very figures in profile, but lots of triangles, things that I could easily cut out, shapes. And at the same time, there was a revival of her work and also a revival of Art Deco. Around a little bit later, Madonna finds her, and she was a huge inspiration visually for Madonna's look through the early 90s, and her videos. And she also, as Madonna was doing so well financially, she started collecting her work, and lived with several of her most famous paintings. So here's this woman who is Polish, comes to Paris, marries a baron, has a privileged life, but she's also a smart, evolving woman. She had lots of female lovers. She was a woman of the age, was a modern woman. She drove a glorious car. She did a car cover with a magazine, but instead of having a man drive it, it's actually a self-portrait of her driving the car. Lots of big shoulders, lots of these amazingly elegant drawings of men who are doctors, and also she did wonderful Adam and Eve. That's very Art Deco. She looks like her pieces look almost like they're crafted in marble, but they're done with really smooth, a smooth kind of brush with these beautiful subtle blending of colors. But again, she's really of the age. And she's just celebrated in Paris. She takes Paris by storm. Paris falls in love with her. And to get your portrait painted by her, there was like a waiting list. But she's the kind of person who painted hard and drank champagne while she painted. She dressed elegantly. Her work is really about a style and a look that once you see it, you'll go, oh my goodness, look at that. And also, she was doing things that she was really kind of evolved as an important woman painter of her era, whereas we're not really aware of. Women have been painting all the time, but because of the fact that they were women, they've kind of left out of the picture. So like the surrealists were not open to letting women participate. It was a very macho kind of surrealist club. And she's on the outside of that. She's more jazz oriented. And the sort of, you could just imagine her painting and smoking with a cigarette holder and these amazing hazy smoke-filled jazzy kind of rooms where the colors are blues and pinks and dark grays, very velvety, very, very, very rich.
Yeah, I mean, her work also it feels very like cubisty almost to me as well. Like there feels like there's something happening in her style that like I can't quite categorize it. Like it's a little bit Art Deco, a little bit Cubist. I'm surprised to hear Surrealist as a connection you're dropping there.
Well, not really Surrealist, but she. I was saying that the Surrealists didn't really let women into their group.
Oh, and I see what you mean. In the way that like Frida wasn't really well known in her day.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood that point there because I always looked at her work as very like sort of geometric and fragmented and boxy, and like the gradients are just like gorgeous in it. Absolutely love.
Well, she's very
work.
much
and
like the flapper painter. Flappers were like women who left behind the constraints of what life was like for women. They bobbed their hair. They wore a different kind of dress. They said goodbye to the bustle. In many cases, they didn't even wear a girdle. And so she's a product of that era, sort of embracing what was possible for a woman. But to become a painter in a man's world, she just kind of did it, and she found her audience.
Yeah, and she did it beautifully. And now that I think I will not see Madonna's videos the same way again. Now that I'm thinking about that influence over her work, it's an interesting connection. Once again, how history just keeps cycling through and these trends keep coming back. It's kind of like how Muka's work was such a big influence on the psychedelic artists
exactly.
The 60s and stuff like that. And now I'm curious how, if at all, her style influenced your style as you went to illustrate when you were creating an image of her.
Well, she was a woman that was very elegant, but she also had a very strong profile. She had a good sized nose. She had these amazing lips. My image of her is of this bold sort of countess who is kind of demanding. She's almost like saying, look at me, look at me, look at me. And the way that I drew her, because her paintings really kind of demand your attention. They fill the whole space. Her art has a real strong sense of, even though it's painted, they feel like a bas-relief sculpture, which no one else had really kind of done that yet.
Yeah, I could see that. And I mean, there is this like authoritative feel to her work and the commanding presence. I think largely that feels to me like it goes along with all deco stuff, where it's so hard edged and it's so almost masculine. It's in, or traditionally masculine in some conceptions of it, that I think it's all the more interesting that one of the icons of that era was a female painter.
Well, what's fascinating is that she kind of outlived her era. Her strongest work is from the 20s, 30s, and then she leaves Paris, winds up in Texas, has a daughter, and then her work that she did in Texas just kind of lost its zip, but time had kind of moved on. Things had sort of changed. And then she winds up painting in Mexico, living in Mexico. And then she's kind of refining herself. But at that point, she's become an older woman and she sort of passes away. And then the world kind of rediscovered her back again in the 80s, where there was another looking back at, in the 80s, everything was about shoulder pads. So the references were old movies, and she kind of emerged again and found a whole new audience, including me.
Yeah. And now, after just one last break, I want to wrap up this series of talking about so many iconic artists with one last female artist, and this one is going to be guest's choice. And now I want to end this with a little bit of a wild card. I mean, the surrealists may not have welcomed female artists, but for this female artists episode, I want to end it in a somewhat surreal fashion by just leaving it all to chance. I'm going to let you surprise me. Who is an iconic female artist that you want to talk about today?
So the guest choice is, I'd love to end with Chicago's very own Lee Goede. Lee Goede was a self-taught artist who was known as the bag lady artist. She came from a wealthy family, very proper upbringing, married. Her husband was a Christian Scientist, and sadly there were a lot of tragedies in her life. She lost one child because they didn't seek medical attention. She lost another child because they didn't seek medical attention, and then sadly she had a nervous breakdown and wound up on the streets. And she had another daughter who was raised by someone else, but we'll get to that later. So she shows up on the steps of the Art Institute and is obsessed with the French Impressionists. She thought of herself as a French Impressionist. She loved hanging out in the French Impressionist collection at the Art Institute. The Chicago Art Institute has one of the greatest French Impressionist collections anywhere in the world, because it was collected by Chicago women when this work was easy to come by, and Paris was still like hanging on and thinking this wasn't interesting. The Chicagoans went there, Bertha Palmer collected a lot of it on her trips of the Palmer House. So this amazing woman starts drawing on inexpensive window shades and pieces of primed canvas. She lived on the streets. She would make enough money, and then she would get a place to stay in a transient hotel. She was always around in Chicago. And when I came back to Chicago after art school, I would see her on the Michigan Avenue Bridge. And my good friend from art school, who is now a very famous illustrator and cartoonist, Tom Bechtel, who wound up working for the New Yorker for 20 years. We shared a studio together. One day, it was a beautiful, sunny Sunday afternoon. We saw her and we said, let's go say hello to Lee Goede. So we went over to Lee Goede, and she just started talking and ranting. She was kind. She was difficult. She was telling stories. She said, let me see what your drawing looks like. And my friend Tom showed her his drawing. She said, you draw ugly. You have to draw something beautiful. My drawings are beautiful. So her drawings were an era that she recalled the Gibson girl, women with big hair and amazing hairdos. And she drew them in profile with a ballpoint pen, and then painted them with tempera paint and watercolor, or sometimes gouache. And then she would varnish them thickly with an inexpensive kind of varnish. She was all over Chicago. And my partner and I went on many dates with Lee Goede. That's who we would hang out with. He collected her work from the very beginning. I wound up being on Antiques Roadshow talking about a Lee Lee Goethe painting a couple of years ago. That seems to be repeated all the time. But she was a fascinating figure who wanted to be celebrated like an artist. And she had her own theories about art. And she told me an amazing sort of funny story that she had gone to see a special exhibit of the Impressionist work, and she knew it was going to overwhelm her with its beauty. So under her armpit, she had a little bit of cheese. And when no one was looking, she thought she was going to faint. She pulled out that piece of cheese, and it gave her the strength so she wouldn't faint from the sheer beauty of looking at these Impressionist paintings. And she made it out and then went home and painted and painted and painted. Well, sadly, life on the streets is very difficult. She wound up having a series of accidents. But about this same time, a woman starts hanging out with Lee Goethe, who no one knows who it is. And by this point, she's written up in magazines. People magazine did a big story. The Reader did a big story. She was kind of getting known. 60 Minutes did a story. She kind of was getting known as the bag lady artist of Chicago. And it turns out this woman who befriended her was actually her long-lost daughter, who lived a very comfortable life. She knew she was adopted. She married, and then her husband said, "Let's go to Paris because that's where everyone goes." And so she tries to get a passport, but she didn't know who her mother was, her birth mother was. So she contacted a relative who said, "Your mother, if you want to find her, she lost her mind and she lives on the streets. She's always in front of the Art Institute." So slowly, this woman named Bonnie befriended. It took a long time for this friendship to happen, but she eventually befriended her own mother. And it's an incredibly famous, fascinating story. And when Lee Goethe died, my partner and I participated at the Arts Club and gathered a bunch of her friends and fellow collectors all to tell these amazing stories about Lee Goethe, who really shaped Chicago with its outsider art. Chicago is unique. Of all the cities in the United States, that we have several self-taught outsider artists who are really extraordinary. And I think that it's sort of the glory of Chicago is that Chicago is this beautiful city, but it's nitty gritty. It's tough and it's hard. It's not easy to live here. But people who want to make art, they find a way. And she definitely found a way. But she really identified with an older era. She identified with the French Impressionists. She loved Renoir. She loved the Gibson Girl. She also had an incredible memory for singing songs. Like one night we wound up hanging out with her, and she sang a beautiful rendition of Lullaby on Broadway. That was like, should have been recorded. She had perfect pitch and she understood the song perfectly. And she said, "You start drawing." And I was drawing in front of her and she said, "You're drawing too fast, slow down. An artist takes its time. You're too fast, you're too fast." But I think she's a really important person who has sort of shaped Chicago as an art city. And I love her work, and I had to include her in the book. I just had to. One of the other things that's really fascinating about her is that she thought nobody would believe that this beautiful painting was painted by her. So she hung out at the Trailways bus station and the Greyhound bus station, and she did these sort of self-portraits in a photo booth that she would then staple or pin to the canvases as proof that this beautiful painting was painted by her. And then her self-portraits she did with these cameras wind up influencing Cindy Sherman, who's known for her strange, elaborate personas and creating these personas, but they were kind of shaped by these early Polaroid self-portraits that Lee Goethe did. So there's all these incredible connections. Again, it's like it just keeps going and going, and sort of the beauty of this project is showing how they're all connected and interwoven together.
That is absolutely amazing. I mean, the connections in there, and honestly, it is just so heartbreaking to think that she didn't feel that people would believe some beautiful paintings could have been produced by her, and so she felt the need to document the process as proof of her work.
Right.
But again, absolutely amazing, the connections with her and other artists and the way that you weave all of this together.
Lee Goethe's paintings, I'd love to hear you describe it, because they're not what one would typically say as beautiful. They're very kind of primitive. They're always drawn in profile. It's almost always an image of a woman. Sometimes it's of a
Okay.
man that she always would refer to as Prince of the City. She would write notes on it on them on these paintings, like "Hurry Spring" or "Chicago, We Own It." She loved Chicago, um, but it's also this harkening back to another era. And she also had her own theories about how the French Impressionists became famous. One of her theories was that everyone loves chocolate, and so chocolate makers were putting French Impressionist pictures on chocolate boxes. So you ate something sweet and you looked at something sweet. This was her theory of how to get your art out there. Put it or serve it with chocolate.
I actually love that. I wish more people served their art with chocolate. Although I feel like I wouldn't trust chocolate that was given to me by an artist at the same time. But these drawings, and paintings, as you talk about, there's something really interesting about them. Like it's interesting to me that you say it harkens back to a previous era, because it also feels very sort of contemporary to me in the way that it's like very simplified forms. And maybe it's because like I am so used to seeing so many contemporary artists who do things that are almost like folk art inspired, where they're simplifying the shapes. There's a flatness to it, and the patterning that we're seeing on there. I'm curious, what are, other than the impressionist impressionist influence, what reads as older era to you?
Well, it's the hairstyle. Often, if you look up what a Gibson girl looks like, there's a classic illustration. It's kind of a big, like turn of the century hairdo. Think of Hello Dolly. Think
Yeah.
of big hairdo, not a bouffant, but a big swept up with hairpins and kind of elegant.
Yeah, and then sometimes there's a hat and,
Yes.
like the big brim on,
Right.
all of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. The fashion, the clothes always date us,
Yes.
That's why I can't look at pictures of myself as a child. But yeah, I guess the fashion does read a little bit older. Um, but an interesting artist, like, and I love the combination of the colors, the color schemes that I'm seeing here, and the balance of the composition. There's something about her way of capturing like the, I don't know. I don't even know. This is how bad I am with fashion, that like I don't know how to describe like the collar, the neckline.
So she
Creates this
thought that
interesting movement.
well, there's a reason. She thought that the clavicle on a woman was the most beautiful part of the woman's body. And she also came from an era where women would wear cameos. So she would buy these inexpensive cameos in junk shops or at Woolworths and sometimes pin a cameo to a picture.
Okay.
Again, harkening back, if you think of your grandmother or your mother's cameo pin,
Yeah.
they have this kind of upswept hair. That's the reference. Like she was someone who had a great tragedy, but she's sort of frozen in time of what was elegant and beautiful. Think of the Gilded Age.
It becomes a little bit Miss Havisham or something,
Well, she was very much. She looked like Miss Havisham. She looked. I mean, she like had a ratty fur coat. One time I felt bad for her, so I bought her a bunch of like clothes. And then, being an entrepreneur, she was selling them in front of Neiman Marcus and said "clothing sale." And she was like selling my old clothes while wearing one of my suits.
I love that. That is absolutely amazing. Oh, thank you so much.
Oh, sure.
That like I love a personal connection to an artist where you get to see the quirks and like these anecdotes about like just what kind of person was it that was creating these pieces. I think so much we look at just this is the image, this is the name of the person who made it. But like the reason that I do the show is I want to get at the humanity and the stories that make up our history.
I agree. When I was in art school, it was a survey class, so there was no time to dwell on one artist. It was just like covering as much ground as possible. And I had heard from one of my friends who went to the school, the Art Institute, that it was kind of when the rebirth of people were discovering Frida Kahlo again in the 70s and in the early 80s, that this one art teacher would take kids to Mexico City to go to Frida Kahlo's house, which was something that never would have happened in the school I went to was very, very conservative and not figurative at all. It was like Cleveland was all about gray color and grids. It was very, very different where Chicago is such a figurative town. The figure is so omnipresent, and also the storytelling, which was missing in the sort of bland artwork where I went to school. But because I was from Chicago and I was doing different kind of things that didn't look like the other students' works, I got a lot of attention, and the teachers like loved it. I mean, I had a very nice career while I was in school, but I also got this great job where I worked at the Cleveland Museum of Art in the bookshop, which is not what like bookshops look like today. I mean, it was the size of a small kitchen. And so I would just wander the halls of the Art Institute and just fall in love with these paintings and then want to learn more and more and more. And there's a contemporary way of education now of using personal experiences as a way to get to talk about the art, which I think is really important, rather than this general view. Hearing something with a point of view is what gets people interested.
Oh, I 100% agree. And
Yeah.
listeners, if you agree, go out and buy The Iconic Artists, published by Trope and available at all sorts of bookstores. Go to your local bookseller, buy yourself a copy. You will not regret it. And if you're enjoying this episode or any other episode, of course, always leave a nice rating or review. But thank you once again, David Lee Csicsko. I really appreciate your being so generous with your time and your expertise.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine, Kyle. Thank you.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.